August 6, 1945. Farm Hall, England. The manor stood quiet in the afternoon heat. 10 German physicists had been living there for nearly 3 months, detained by British intelligence in a country estate that looked more like a vacation house than a prison. They played chess. They argued about quantum mechanics. They walked in the garden. They waited. None of them knew why they were really there. Werner Heisenberg sat by the window in the drawing room, a newspaper folded on his lap. He wasn't reading it. Outside, the English countryside stretched green and indifferent, as if the war had never happened. But it had. Germany had surrendered 3 months ago. The Reich that promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. And still, they waited. Otto Hahn stood near the piano, his hands behind his back. He was 56, older than most of them, and the weight of those years showed in the way he carried himself, shoulders slightly bent, eyes often distant. He had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, the splitting of the uranium atom. It was the kind of discovery that should have earned him a Nobel Prize. Instead, it had earned him this: detention in a foreign country, uncertainty about his family, and a gnawing question he never spoke aloud. What have we done? Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker was younger, sharper, more restless. He paced near the bookshelf, pulling out volumes he had already read, putting them back. He had worked under Heisenberg during the war, part of the German nuclear program, the Uranverein, they called it. The Uranium Club. It sounded almost quaint now, like a gentleman's society. But it hadn't been quaint. It had been a race. A race they had lost. The others were scattered throughout the house. Walther Gerlach, who had led the program in its final desperate months. Max von Laue, the elder statesman, who had refused to work on weapons. Karl Wirtz, Erich Bagge, Horst Korsching, all brilliant, all trapped in the same limbo. They had been brought here in July, flown from Germany under guard, told nothing. The British officers were polite but firm. The house was comfortable but monitored. They could speak freely, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that every room was wired. Microphones hidden in the walls, in the light fixtures, in the furniture. Every conversation recorded, every argument transcribed, every silence noted. The British wanted to know one thing: how close had Germany come to building the bomb? The days blurred together. Breakfast at 8. Lunch at 1. Dinner at 7. In between, the slow erosion of certainty. Heisenberg spent hours at the blackboard in the makeshift study, working through equations that no longer mattered. Von Weizsäcker read philosophy, Kant, Hegel, anything to escape the present. Hahn took long walks alone, his face unreadable. They argued, of course. Physicists always argued. But the arguments had changed. They were no longer about science. They were about blame. "We did our duty," Gerlach said one evening, his voice tight. "We worked for our country. What else could we have done?" "We could have worked slower," von Laue replied quietly. He was the only one among them who had openly resisted. "We could have failed on purpose. And been shot for sabotage?" Wirtz shot back. "Easy to say now." Heisenberg said nothing. He stood at the window, watching the light fade over the fields. He had led the program. He had made the calculations. He had told the Nazi officials that a bomb was theoretically possible but practically difficult. He had emphasized the difficulties. Had he slowed the work deliberately? Or had he simply failed? He didn't know anymore. And that uncertainty was worse than any accusation. The British officers came and went, polite and distant. Major Rittner, their chief handler, was a German-speaking Jew who had fled Berlin in the 1930s. He treated them with courtesy, but his eyes were cold. He knew what they had worked on. He knew what they had tried to build. One afternoon, Hahn asked him directly, "Why are we here?" Rittner smiled, a thin, professional smile. "For your own safety, Dr. Hahn." Safety from whom? From people who might not understand the difference between a scientist and a soldier. Hahn didn't ask again. By early August, the waiting had become its own kind of torture. The war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific dragged on. The newspapers brought reports of American bombers over Japan, of cities burning, of an enemy that refused to surrender. The physicists read the reports with detached interest. It was someone else's war now. On the evening of August 6th, they gathered in the drawing room after dinner. The BBC was on the radio, a low murmur of voices discussing post-war reconstruction. Hans sat in his usual chair, staring at nothing. Heisenberg played a few notes on the piano, then stopped. Von Weizsäcker was about to suggest a game of cards when the door opened. Major Rittner stepped inside. His face was neutral, but there was something in his posture, a tension, a readiness, that made them all look up. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I have news." The room went still. This afternoon, the Americans dropped a new type of bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. A single bomb. The city has been destroyed. No one moved. The bomb, Rittner continued, his voice steady, was atomic. The word hung in the air like smoke. Hans stood slowly, his face draining of color. "That's impossible." "It's confirmed," Rittner said. "President Truman announced it an hour ago. The bomb used uranium fission. One bomb. One city." Heisenberg's hands fell from the piano keys. Von Weizsäcker sat down heavily. Gerlach turned away, his shoulders shaking. Rittner watched them for a moment, then left the room without another word. For a long time, no one spoke. Han walked to the window, his hands trembling. He pressed his palms against the glass, as if trying to steady himself. His breath fogged the pain. "They did it," he whispered. "They actually did it." "It's not possible," Heisenberg said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The engineering alone, the isotope separation, it would take years, industrial capacity we knew they didn't have." "They had it," von Weizsäcker said flatly. "And we didn't." Wirtz stood abruptly. "This is propaganda. It has to be. One bomb? An entire city? They're exaggerating to force Japan to surrender." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Han turned from the window. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow. "I discovered fission," he said quietly. "I split the atom. And now they've used it to kill a city." "You didn't build the bomb, Otto," von Lau said gently. "I gave them the key." Han's voice cracked. "I opened the door." Heisenberg stood, his mind racing. "We need to understand the design. How did they achieve critical mass? What kind of detonation mechanism? If they used uranium-235, the enrichment process alone. Does it matter?" Gerlach's voice was raw. "Does any of it matter now?" Heisenberg stopped. He looked around the room at the faces of his colleagues, brilliant men, men who had spent years chasing the same goal, men who had failed. And in that moment, the equation changed. They had told themselves they were working for science. For Germany. For survival. They had told themselves that the bomb was too difficult, too expensive, too far beyond reach. But the Americans had built it. Which meant it had always been possible. Which meant they could have built it too. Which meant every choice they had made, every delay, every miscalculation, every report emphasizing difficulties, had been a choice. Heisenberg sat down slowly. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. "We failed," he said quietly. "We failed, and they succeeded." No one answered. Outside, the English countryside darkened into night. Inside, 10 men sat in silence, each alone with the weight of what they had just learned. The war was over. But the reckoning had just begun. August 6th to 7th, 1945. Farm Hall, England. The night stretched long and sleepless. Han retreated to his room immediately after the announcement. He closed the door, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at his hands. They were the hands of a scientist, ink-stained, callous from years of laboratory work. Hands that had held test tubes, adjusted instruments, recorded measurements. Hands that had split the atom. He thought of Hiroshima. He didn't know what the city looked like. He had never been to Japan. But he could imagine it: streets, homes, people going about their lives. And then, in an instant, light. Heat. Silence. How many? 10,000? 50,000? More? He stood abruptly, walked to the small desk, and pulled out a sheet of paper. He would write a letter. To whom? He didn't know. To the world, perhaps. An apology. An explanation. He picked up the pen. The paper remained blank. What could he possibly say? Downstairs, the others gathered in small groups, their voices low and tense. Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker sat in the study, the blackboard covered in hastily scrawled calculations. Heisenberg was trying to reverse engineer the American bomb based on the limited information they had. If they used gun-type assembly, Heisenberg muttered, chalk clicking against the board, the critical mass would need to be, no, that's too much uranium. Unless they achieved higher enrichment than we thought possible. Von Weizsäcker watched him, arms crossed. Werner, what are you doing? I'm trying to understand how they did it. Why? Heisenberg paused, chalk hovering over the board. Because we should have done it first. Should we have? Von Weizsäcker's voice was quiet but sharp. Should we have given Hitler an atomic bomb? The question hung between them. Heisenberg lowered the chalk. We didn't give him anything. We failed. Did we fail? Or did we choose to fail? Heisenberg turned, his face tight. I made no such choice. We worked. We calculated. We reported our findings honestly. If the resources weren't there, if the industrial capacity wasn't sufficient, the Americans had the same challenges. They overcame them. They had more money. More uranium. More time without bombs falling on their laboratories. They had more will, von Weizsäcker said quietly. They wanted it more than we did. Heisenberg stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe, deep down, we didn't want to succeed. Maybe we told ourselves it was impossible because we needed it to be impossible. Heisenberg turned back to the blackboard. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the chalk again. I don't know what I wanted anymore. In the dining room, Gerlach sat alone at the long table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He hadn't touched it. He just stared at the amber liquid, watching the way the light moved through it. He had taken over the Uranverein in the final months of the war, when everything was already collapsing. He had pushed the scientists, begged for resources, filed optimistic reports to keep the funding alive. He had believed, truly believed, that they could still do it. That they could still matter. And now he knew the truth. They had never been close. The Americans had been years ahead, building vast facilities, employing thousands, spending billions. While Germany's program had been a handful of men in scattered laboratories, arguing over scraps of uranium and outdated equipment. They had been playing at war while the Americans had been waging it. Gerlach picked up the glass and drank it in one swallow. It burned, but he welcomed the pain. It was something real, something he could feel. Upstairs, von Lau sat in his room, reading by lamplight. He had chosen a volume of poetry, Rilke. The words washed over him, familiar and distant. He had refused to work on weapons. From the beginning, he had made his position clear. Science was for understanding, not destruction. He had paid a price for that stance, marginalization, suspicion, isolation. But he had kept his conscience clear. And yet, tonight, he felt no satisfaction. Because the bomb had been built anyway. Not by him, but by others. And the result was the same. He closed the book and set it aside. Outside his window, the stars were bright and indifferent. Somewhere across the ocean, a city was burning. And here he sat, in a comfortable room, reading poetry. What good had his principles done? Near midnight, there was a knock on Hans' door. He opened it to find Heisenberg standing in the hallway, his face drawn and pale. "I can't sleep," Heisenberg said simply. Han stepped aside, and Heisenberg entered. They sat in silence for a moment, two men who had known each other for decades, who had built careers in the same field, who had navigated the same impossible choices. "Do you think it's true?" Han asked finally. "One bomb, one city?" "Yes," Heisenberg said. "I've been working through the physics. It's possible. Difficult, but possible. They must have used uranium-235, highly enriched. The energy release would be..." He stopped himself. "Yes. It's true." Han nodded slowly. "Then I am responsible. Otto. I discovered fission. I published the results. I gave the world the knowledge. What they did with it," his voice broke. "What they did with it is on me." "You're a scientist," Heisenberg said. "You discovered a truth about nature. You can't be held responsible for how others use that truth. Can I?" Han looked at him, eyes red-rimmed. "If I had kept it secret, someone else would have found it. Fermi, Joliot-Curie, the Americans. You can't suppress knowledge, Otto. It finds its way out." "Then we're all damned," Han whispered. "Every scientist who ever discovered anything dangerous. We open doors we can't close." Heisenberg had no answer to that. They sat in silence as the clock on the mantel ticked toward morning. August 7th, 1945. Morning. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The men gathered in the dining room, but few ate. The newspapers had arrived, and they passed them around with shaking hands. The headlines screamed in bold type. "Atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. New age of warfare begins. Truman harnessed the basic power of the universe." The articles provided more details. The bomb had been dropped from a B-29 bomber called Enola Gay. The explosion had been equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The city had been obliterated in seconds. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands, possibly more. President Truman's statement was printed in full. He spoke of scientific achievement, of ending the war, of saving American lives. He warned Japan to surrender or face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Wirtz threw the paper down. "They're threatening to do it again." "Of course they are," von Weizsäcker said quietly. "Why build one bomb when you can build 10? 100? This is madness," Baggs said, his voice rising. "This is the end of civilization." "No," Heisenberg said, his voice hollow. "This is the beginning of something new. Something we don't have a name for yet." Han stood abruptly and left the room. No one followed him. In the garden, Han walked among the roses, their blooms bright and oblivious. He found a bench beneath an old oak tree and sat down heavily. He thought of his wife, Edith, back in Germany. He hadn't seen her in months. He didn't know if she was safe, if she had food, if she even knew where he was. The letters he was allowed to send were censored, stripped of meaning. What would he tell her when he finally saw her again? "I helped create the weapon that destroyed a city. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to understand the atom." Would she understand? Would anyone? He heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up. Major Rittner approached, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Han," Rittner said quietly. "Are you all right?" Han almost laughed. "No. I am not all right." Rittner sat down beside him, uninvited. For a moment, they simply sat together in the morning sun. "You know," Rittner said finally, "I left Germany in 1933. I watched from England as my country, my former country, descended into barbarism. I watched as people I knew, people I had grown up with, either joined the madness or looked away. And I asked myself, what would I have done if I had stayed? Would I have resisted? Or would I have survived?" Han said nothing. "I don't know the answer," Rittner continued. "I'd like to think I would have been brave. But I suspect I would have been like most people, trying to keep my head down, trying to protect my family, telling myself that I was just doing my job. Why are you telling me this? Han asked. Because you're asking yourself the same question. And I want you to know that there is no good answer. There is only what you did, and what you do next. Rittner stood and walked back toward the house, leaving Han alone beneath the oak tree. That afternoon, the physicists gathered in the drawing room. Someone had suggested they draft a statement, something for the British, for the Americans, for history. An explanation of their work, their intentions, their failures. But every attempt dissolved into argument. We should emphasize that we never wanted to build a bomb for Hitler, Gerlach insisted. But we tried, Wirtz countered. We worked on it. That's a fact. We worked slowly, von Weizsäcker said. We emphasized difficulties. Did we? Heisenberg's voice was sharp. Or did we simply fail and tell ourselves it was deliberate? The room fell silent. I don't know anymore, Heisenberg admitted, his voice dropping. I don't know what I intended. I don't know if I slowed the work or if I was simply incompetent. I don't know if I'm a hero or a failure or something in between. Han looked around the room at the faces of his colleagues, brilliant men, moral men, men who had lived through impossible times and made impossible choices. Perhaps, Han said slowly, we are all of those things. Perhaps we don't get to choose which one history remembers. No one argued with that. As evening fell, the men dispersed to their rooms. The statement was never written. Heisenberg stood at his window, watching the sun set over the English fields. Somewhere across the ocean, the sun was rising over the ruins of Hiroshima. He thought of all the calculations he had made, all the reports he had filed, all the conversations with Nazi officials where he had emphasized how difficult, how expensive, how uncertain the bomb project was. Had he been honest? Or had he been sabotaging the work without admitting it to himself? He would never know. The truth was buried beneath layers of memory, justification, and fear. But one thing was certain, the Americans had succeeded where he had failed. And the world would never be the same. He turned from the window and lay down on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep did not come. August 8th to 9th, 1945. Farm Hall, England. The second day after Hiroshima brought no relief. If anything, the weight had grown heavier. The newspapers continued their coverage. Photographs had begun to emerge, grainy, distant shots of a mushroom cloud rising over what had once been a city. The images were almost abstract, too large to comprehend. A column of smoke and ash reaching into the stratosphere, dwarfing everything below it. The physicists studied the photographs with the detached intensity of men examining an equation. They measured the cloud's height, estimated the yield, debated the detonation altitude. It was easier to think about numbers than about people. But the people were there, in the articles beneath the photographs. Eyewitness accounts from the outskirts of the blast zone. Descriptions of burns, of buildings vaporized, of shadows permanently etched into stone where human beings had stood. Korsching read one account aloud, his voice flat. Survivors reported that the injured walked through the streets like ghosts, their skin hanging from their bodies, their eyes blank. Many died within hours. Others are still dying. He set the paper down carefully, as if it might break. No one spoke. Han had not left his room since the previous evening. Von Lau knocked on his door mid-morning, carrying a tray of tea and bread. Otto, he called gently. You need to eat. There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened. Han looked worse than Von Lau had ever seen him, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his shirt wrinkled and unbuttoned at the collar. I can't, Han said simply. Can't eat? Can't live with this. Von Lau stepped inside and set the tray on the desk. You're not responsible for what the Americans did. I gave them the key, Max. I discovered fission. I published it. I made this possible. You discovered a truth about the universe, Von Lau said firmly. That's what scientists do. You can't be blamed for how others weaponize knowledge. Can I? Han's voice rose, raw and desperate. If I had kept it secret, if I had destroyed my notes, someone else would have found it. Fermi was close. Joliot-Curie was close. You can't stop the march of knowledge, Otto. It moves forward whether we want it to or not. Hans sank into the chair by the window. Then what's the point? What's the point of any of it if every discovery just gives humanity new ways to destroy itself? Von Lau had no answer. He sat down across from Han, and they remained there in silence, two old men watching the morning light move across the floor. Downstairs, Heisenberg had filled 3 blackboards with calculations. He had barely slept, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name. He needed to understand. He needed to know exactly how the Americans had done it, what they had achieved, where Germany's program had fallen short. Von Weizsäcker found him there, chalk dust covering his hands and sleeves. "Werner," von Weizsäcker said quietly. "You need to stop." "I'm almost there," Heisenberg muttered, not turning around. If they used a cylindrical configuration with a beryllium reflector, the critical mass could be reduced to. "Werner." Von Weizsäcker's voice was sharper now. "Stop." Heisenberg finally turned, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. "I need to understand how we failed." "We didn't fail," von Weizsäcker said. "We chose not to succeed." "That's a comforting lie." "Is it? Look at these calculations, Werner. Look at what you're doing. You're reverse engineering a weapon that killed 100,000 people. Why? To prove you could have built it too? To prove you're as clever as Oppenheimer?" Heisenberg stared at him, breathing hard. "We didn't build the bomb," von Weizsäcker continued, his voice steady. "Maybe that was incompetence. Maybe it was lack of resources. Maybe it was unconscious sabotage. But the result is the same. We didn't give Hitler an atomic weapon. And that, Werner, is the only thing that matters." Heisenberg's hands fell to his sides. The chalk slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. "I wanted to succeed," he whispered. "God help me, part of me wanted to be the one who did it. To solve the problem. To prove it was possible." "I know," von Weizsäcker said. "We all did. That's what makes us human. But we didn't do it. And maybe that's the one thing we got right." Heisenberg walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass. Outside, the English countryside was green and peaceful, utterly unchanged by the news from across the world. "They'll build more," he said quietly. "The Americans. The British. Eventually the Russians. This is just the beginning." "Yes," von Weizsäcker agreed. "It is. And we opened that door. We all did. Every physicist who ever studied the nucleus. Every government that ever funded the research. Every human being who ever wondered if we could split the atom." Von Weizsäcker paused. "The question now is, what do we do next?" Heisenberg had no answer. August 9, 1945. 11 a.m. Major Rittner entered the drawing room where several of the physicists had gathered. His face was grim. "Gentlemen," he said. "There's been another bombing." The room froze. This morning, the Americans dropped a second atomic bomb. On the city of Nagasaki. Gerlach stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Another one?" "Yes. A plutonium device this time, according to initial reports. Different design from the Hiroshima bomb. They have 2 types." Wirtz's voice was barely a whisper. "How many do they have?" Rittner's expression was unreadable. "I don't know. But I suspect they're prepared to use as many as necessary to force Japan's surrender." He left them with that thought. The news of Nagasaki broke something in the group that Hiroshima had only cracked. One bomb could be explained away, a desperate measure, a singular act to end the war quickly, to save lives in the long run. The moral calculus was ugly, but it could be made. 2 bombs shattered that rationalization. 2 bombs meant this was a weapon of policy, not desperation. 2 bombs meant the Americans had an arsenal. 2 bombs meant the atomic age had truly begun. Gerlach walked out into the garden and didn't return for hours. When he finally came back, his eyes were dry but his face was stone. Baggs sat at the piano and played Beethoven, the notes falling like rain in the silent house. Wirtz and Korsching argued in low, tense voices about what it meant, what would happen next, whether Japan would surrender or if the Americans would drop a 3rd bomb, a 4th, a 5th. And Hahn remained in his room, alone with his thoughts and his guilt. August 9, 1945. Evening. As darkness fell, the 10 physicists found themselves drawn together in the drawing room. No one had called a meeting. They simply gravitated toward each other, seeking something: comfort, understanding, shared burden. They sat in chairs and on sofas, some with drinks, some with cigarettes, all with the same haunted expression. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Hahn entered. He moved slowly, like a man walking through water. He sat in the chair by the fireplace, his hands folded in his lap. "I want to say something," he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "I have spent the last 3 days drowning in guilt," Hahn continued, his voice steady but soft. "I discovered fission. I made this possible. And I have been asking myself, am I responsible for Hiroshima? For Nagasaki? For every death caused by these bombs?" He paused, looking around the room. "And I have realized something. The answer is yes. And no." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Yes, I am responsible. My discovery made this possible. But so is Rutherford, who discovered the nucleus. So is Becquerel, who discovered radioactivity. So is every scientist who ever studied the atom. We are all links in a chain that led to this moment. But," he continued, his voice growing firmer, "I am not responsible for the decision to build the bomb. I am not responsible for the decision to use it. Those were choices made by politicians, by generals, by men who saw in our science a tool for war." He sat back, his hands still folded. "We cannot stop knowledge from being discovered. We cannot prevent science from advancing. But we must, speak out about how that knowledge is used. We must be the conscience that warns against the dangers. We must be the voice that says, just because we can do something does not mean we should." The room was silent. Then von Lau spoke, his voice gentle. "You're right, Otto. We can't change what's been done. But we can change what comes next. Can we?" Gerlach's voice was bitter. "We're prisoners here. We have no power, no influence. Who will listen to us?" "History will listen," Heisenberg said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "Right now, we're footnotes. The Germans who failed to build the bomb. But in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, people will ask, what did the scientists think? What did they say? What did they do when they learned what their work had created?" He stood, walking to the center of the room. "We have a choice," Heisenberg continued. "We can spend the rest of our lives justifying ourselves, explaining why we failed or didn't fail, arguing about who was responsible. Or we can accept what happened and dedicate ourselves to making sure it never happens again." "How?" Wirtz asked. "How do we do that?" "By telling the truth," von Weizsäcker said. "By being honest about the dangers. By refusing to let governments turn science into weapons without question. By teaching the next generation of physicists that they have a responsibility beyond the laboratory. By remembering," Hahn added softly, "that every equation has consequences. Every discovery has a cost. And we must be willing to bear that cost." The conversation continued late into the night. They talked about the future of physics, about international cooperation, about the need for scientists to engage with ethics and policy. They talked about what they would say when they were finally released, how they would explain their work, their choices, their failures. They didn't reach any grand conclusions. There were no easy answers, no redemptive moments, no sudden clarity. But something had shifted. The paralyzing guilt had transformed into something else, not absolution, but acceptance. Not peace, but purpose. They couldn't change what had happened. They couldn't undo Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They couldn't erase their role in the chain of discovery that had led to the atomic bomb. But they could choose what came next. August 10, 1945. Morning. Han woke early and went down to breakfast. For the first time in days, he ate. The food tasted like ash, but he ate anyway. Heisenberg joined him, then von Lau, then the others. They sat around the table, these 10 men who had lived through the end of one world and the beginning of another. The radio was on in the background, broadcasting news. The announcer's voice was crisp and professional. Reports from Japan suggest that the government is considering surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito is expected to address the nation within days. The physicists listened in silence. The war was ending. Not with a negotiated peace, not with a final battle, but with 2 flashes of light that had rewritten the rules of warfare forever. And these 10 men in an English country house, had been part of making that possible. Not by building the bomb, but by opening the door to the knowledge that made it inevitable. Later that morning, Han walked out into the garden one more time. The roses were still blooming, the sky was still blue, the world was still turning. He thought of his wife, waiting for him in Germany. He thought of his laboratory, his students, his life's work. He thought of the atom he had split, the discovery he had made, the door he had opened. He couldn't close that door. No one could. But he could stand guard at it. He could warn others of what lay beyond. He could spend the rest of his life trying to ensure that the power they had unleashed would be controlled, limited, perhaps one day eliminated. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough. But it was something. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Heisenberg approaching. "Otto," Heisenberg said quietly. "Are you all right?" Han considered the question. Was he all right? No. He would never be all right again. None of them would. But he was still here. Still breathing. Still capable of making choices. "No," Han said honestly. "But I will be." Heisenberg nodded. They stood together in the garden, 2 men who had spent their lives studying the fundamental nature of reality, who had discovered truths about the universe that humanity wasn't ready for. "What do we do now?" Heisenberg asked. Han looked up at the sky, at the sun that powered itself through the same fusion reactions they had studied, the same atomic forces they had tried to harness. "We live with it," Han said simply. "We bear witness. We tell the truth. And we make sure the next generation understands the weight of what they're discovering." "That's not much," Heisenberg said. "No," Han agreed. "But it's all we have." August 15, 1945. The announcement came over the radio at noon. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and distant, speaking words that had never been spoken by a Japanese emperor before. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. The physicists gathered in the drawing room, listening to the broadcast. When it ended, they sat in silence. 6 days. 2 bombs. Hundreds of thousands dead. And the war that had consumed the world for 6 years had finally ended. Not with glory. Not with triumph. But with fire from the sky and the splitting of atoms. Gerlach raised his glass. To the end of the war. The others raised their glasses as well. To the end of the war, they echoed. But none of them smiled. Because they knew the truth. The war was over. But the atomic age had just begun. And these 10 men who had failed to build the bomb, would spend the rest of their lives living with the knowledge that their failure might have been the only thing they got right. Han stood at the window, watching the afternoon light slant across the English countryside. Somewhere across the ocean, the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still smoldered. Somewhere in America, scientists were celebrating their triumph. Somewhere in Russia, other scientists were already beginning their own atomic program. The door he had opened would never close. But he would stand at it for as long as he lived and warn everyone who approached. Be careful. Be so very careful. Because once you step through, there is no going back. He turned from the window and walked back to join his colleagues. They had work to do. Not the work of building weapons, but the work of building a world that might survive them. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. And it would have to be enough.